The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Patrick Kim, and I'm the Work Comp Specialist at Beere&Purves. And I want to thank you all for joining me on today's webinar. So for today, I'll be just doing a high-level overview of workers' compensation in terms of some of the intricacies involved with ownership changes and entity changes. And the goal of this webinar really is to get you all familiar with one of the more trickier topics of work comp servicing, which is dealing with any sort of ownership or entity change. So in life and health industry, when there is an ownership change, typically we just let the carrier know and send over legal docs and the group's taken care of. However, with workers' compensation, ownership and entity changes require a little more work just because there's a lot more information involved with regards to the state as well as to the carrier in terms of ownership and entities. So everything we go over today is general information and can be applied to any work comp carrier in California. Also, this webinar is going to be recorded, so if you do miss anything, you can just rewatch the webinar via the link I'll be sending to you through your email that's used to register. So essentially for the webinar, we'll be going over kind of like a trip down memory lane in terms of ownership change rules, and then bring us back to the present. So I'm going to talk about how work comp waivers used to work, the timeline of the legislation that came along, starting with AB 2883, which changed how the original rules worked, and then SB 189, which came along and changed those new rules. And then I'll give kind of a general overview of ownership and entity changes, the process, including how to report an ownership change, and then we can finish off with a Q&A session. So prior to 2015, work comp carriers would usually just take the word of policyholders when it came to ownership. So during the quote process, the group would pretty much just let the carrier know who's an owner on the application, how much they owned of the organization, and whether or not that owner in question should be included or would be waiving workers' compensation coverage. The issue here, though, is that some groups would have staff members that had really high work comp rates, and in order to keep premiums down, the organization would give kind of exotic titles or issued marginal shares of ownership so that they would be waived from work comp coverage. An example would be a janitor. An organization might give this janitor the title of Director of Sanitation, and then give them a 0.05% ownership share within the organization, or some ridiculous number kind of like that. So when this group was getting quoted for workers' compensation on the application or in a letter to the carrier, they would just say, please exclude this person and their payroll of XYZ amount, so that because they're in ownership and they have a share of they have an ownership share in the organization, so that person would not be included in work comp coverage and would not have their payroll included for the purposes of premium calculations. Now, the idea behind providing work comp waivers and making sure that people, at least specifically the owners of an organization, are excluded from workers' compensation is so that these owners, they wouldn't be forced to pay premiums for a product that would make the owner file a claim against themselves if that owner were to file a claim. In the eyes of the Department of Industrial Relations and the work comp carriers, and the state actually, the owner of an organization is responsible for the general operations, including the safety and well-being of its employees. So if an owner were to be on work comp and they file a claim, their premiums would go up because of that claim, and any sort of disciplinary or regulatory measures that need to be implemented would fall on the owner as well. So the state, the carriers, and Department of Industrial Relations kind of came together and said, well, that's not exactly fair. Work comp coverage is mandatory in order to protect the safety and well-being of employees, but it's going a little too far when it comes to mandating that owners be included in coverage as well. So that's why they allowed owners of the organization to waive their work comp coverage. The cause of the additional legislation that I'll be cutting into a little later is that um, this is the people were essentially abusing the exclusion and waiver systems of the past. Again, high-rated staff members were being excluded from coverage improperly, and groups would also abuse those waivers to avoid any sort of owed balance during their payroll audit. So for work comp, premiums are calculated based upon payroll. And naturally, like any organization, payroll is going to change during every calendar year. It's going to go up and down with new hires, terminations, promotions, et cetera, et cetera. And the purpose of an end of year audit was to capture those variances and just to make sure that what the carrier is being charging in terms of premium is 100% accurate. So any underpaid premiums that would have to be invoiced out, any overpaid premiums the carrier would have to refund back to the group because it's for legal and fairness reasons. But again, in the terms of an audit, let's say the group had a $1,000 owed balance because they forgot to report a significant payroll change. Sometimes a group might just say, well, we looked at our payroll information and unfortunately, Mr. Miss, auditor at the carrier, there was a mistake on the audit. Can you change it so that this person be removed from work comp coverage for the purposes of your audit because we forgot to say that they were an owner within the organization, thus we need to lower the payroll projections. And so naturally the carrier would take their word for it and oblige and just say, okay, our mistake, here's your refund check, or we'll erase that owed balance for you. So essentially what was going on is that staff that really needed the work comp, the higher rated folks, were being excluded from coverage in order to save on premiums, or the group was abusing the waivers in order to save on the final audit owed balances. So in order to combat the issues with exclusions, the legislature really decided to step in and pass AB 2883, which required that in order for owners to waive workers' compensation, they needed to provide a specific exclusion form. And in the case for corporations, the owners would need to have at least 15% ownership in the organization, have a corporate officer title, and send in the exclusion form. To put it gently, the new requirements caused quite a bit of headache in the California work comp market because all of a sudden carriers and agents had to scramble, make sure their groups were submitting the correct waiver forms. And they also had to check that for corporate officers that they had the correct amount of ownership within the organization in order to waive work comp. For corporations, that can be quite tricky because they do have outside shareholders that might purchase a majority of the organization's ownership shares. So sometimes you'd run into a group that would have everything in spades. They would have a corporate officer title, and they would have all their legal docs proving that they are in fact a corporate officer title, and have the corporate board meeting minutes. But when it came to the ownership shares, they were kind of out of luck because they might have only 14%, or for some particularly large organizations, they might have only 5% ownership within an organization. So corporations, with regards to then new AB 283 work comp exclusion rules, got hit pretty badly. And for those that didn't respond to the waiver form request, either from the carrier or from the agent, groups would pretty much be guaranteed with a nasty surprise at the end of their policy term when they conducted the audit. This is because the owners that did not respond to the waiver request had their payroll included in the premium calculations, which more often than not resulted in a large catch-up invoice. Typically, an owner has quite high payroll, and the more payroll you have, the higher your work comp premiums are going to be. And another kind of repercussion was that, well, not exactly repercussion, but kind of what exacerbated the inconvenience issues was that from the date the legislation was passed to the last day the carriers and the groups could get those waiver forms in or make sure that any sort of ownership allocations were satisfied, groups and pretty much only had a couple months in order to get all that together. So everyone was really scrambling to get everything together and get their ownership squared away, get their docs squared away, and just make sure that they could provide documentation verifying their ownership. For a time, though, carriers did try to alleviate some of the issues involved, at least with the exclusion forms arriving in late, by backdating the effective date the exclusion form was received. But the Department of Insurance put a stop to that practice pretty darn quickly. So let's say, all the documents in the waiver forms were supposed to be received by the end of the year. Groups would say, look, I had a very busy fourth quarter, as we all did, and I just couldn't, knuckle down, get my ownership stuff squared away. Here's my exclusion form, and it's February of the next year. The carriers would say, okay, we feel sorry for you, and we understand your situation. So even though we received the exclusion form February of the next year, we'll just put the effective date as the end of the, end of year last year. The CDI pretty much put a bold, pretty blunt letter saying, for the purposes and our interpretation of the legislation, we cannot backdate any sort of exclusions. So there wasn't really any wiggle room on that. So those previous exclusion forms, unfortunately, had to get reversed, and people still got hit with that large owed balance. SB 189 was passed in the aftermath of AB 2883 to try to alleviate some of the issues that AB 2883 caused. One big issue was that it dramatically shrank the population of work comp eligible waivers. Another issue was that very small businesses, like your average mom and pop store, they had family members essentially be included in work comp, even though that they were an owner within the organization and they were very unlikely to file a work comp claim against their own family business. And they also had health insurance to cover any sort of incidents should an injury occur. So what SB 189 did was essentially it made it a little easier for people to waive coverage, particularly on the corporate side. So originally for AB 283, corporate officers needed 15% ownership. SB 189, which is the current prevailing exclusion legislation, changed it so that corporations only need 10% ownership and an officer title to waive work comp coverage. Second is that family corporations could have family members actually waive work comp coverage if that specific family member was directly related to an owner with 10% ownership. So let's say you have a mom and pop store and they have a son. The father and mother, they own, let's say together they own 90 ownership shares. Some other family members own 9% of the shares, and their direct son owns 1% share of the organization. Because the son has at least 1% ownership in the organization and is a direct family member with someone that has at least 10% ownership, the son could be waived from work comp coverage. And in terms of professional corporations like physician offices, attorneys, CPAs, owners could also waive work comp coverage if that owner, him or herself, was a practitioner of the business and had health coverage comparable to work comp coverage. So again, let's say you have a CPA. The CPA also does accounting work, balancing books, filing taxes, whatever for clients. And that person has health insurance that can provide comparable coverage to work comp in terms of the medical benefits and whatnot. That person would also be eligible to waive workers' compensation coverage. In terms of other organizations outside of corporations, the sole props, partnerships, LLC, nothing changed. So long as they have 1% ownership in the organization and they get that waiver form in, they can be excluded from coverage. And again, just to kind of really emphasize, to wash away some of the confusion, SB 189 is the prevailing legislation when it comes to work comp exclusions. So moving forward now, when a work comp quote is ever issued, the work comp carrier will make available an exclusion form that specifies owners It has boxes asking about if the owner is a practitioner with health coverage, is a direct family member, have a corporate officer title, making sure that they have at least 10% ownership, stuff like that. So when a group does experience ownership or entity change, this is something that needs to be reported to the Work Comp Insurance Rating Bureau ASAP. This is just to make sure that all the regulatory entities can update their records and to make sure that the work comp policy reflects the correct business type. And because of new ownership exclusion rules, also to make sure that the correct exclusion forms are being processed. Something to consider is that depending on the nature of the entity change, the work comp policy might have to be totally rewritten. What triggers the policy rewrite is when there's an ownership change involving 50%. So if, let's say you have an organization and 50% ownership is swapping hands, or the group's ownership structure gets totally flipped around. The group gets a new FEIN, they get a new DBA, they get a new entity type from a corp to an LLC or vice versa. That's something that might also trigger a complete rewrite of the policy. The rewrite isn't a complicated process at all. The carrier already has all the information necessary to rewrite the group. But what usually does get lost in the weeds, unfortunately, is that because the policy is being rewritten, the old policy is going to be terminated, and as such, an end of policy term payroll audit needs to be conducted. And again, this is so that the carrier can refund any overpaid premiums or invoice any underpaid premiums. In the eyes of the carriers and the regulatory entities, these sort of significant changes in ownership, entity, DBA, et cetera, that in their eyes, they're essentially saying this is a brand new business, it's a brand new organization with a new structure, with that probably has to file new legal documentation as well. Therefore, when it comes to the purposes of workers' compensation compliance, we're going to say the old policy goes with the old business, and the new policy is going to go with the new business. So really, anytime there's an ownership change for the purposes of workers' compensation, we need to have these items prepped and ready to roll beforehand. So we need to know the effective date of the ownership change, because this date is going to determine the effective date of the group's rewritten policy, term date of the group's old policy, and also be used as a date to make sure that there's no lapse in workers' compensation coverage for the purposes of compliance. And the next aspect is the reason for the change. This is important because it helps the carrier as well as the regulatory entities determine whether or not the group can just maintain coverage as normal, or if we need to prepare another ownership change in the future. So an example might be we have a chiropractic office. One of their members is going to retire, and the organization anticipates hiring a new owner shareholder in the future. That lets the carrier know that, okay, on such and such date, we're going to change it. The ownership share is going to be this, but on another future date, the ownership share is going to be that, and this is who the new owner will be. This is just to give the carrier and regulatory entities an update so that they're not seeing these kind of dramatic and rapid swings of ownership. So they're not going to scratch their heads and say, okay, what's going on here? Someone trying to play a game with us, essentially. Obviously, we need the ownership percentages just so that we can make sure that those that are eligible to be waived from work comp can be waived from work comp. So for the purposes of corporations, again, we need to make sure that 10% ownership is always there, as well as for the records for the regulatory entities. They just need to make sure that 100% ownership of the organization is always accounted for. It doesn't matter if the majority of the shares with shareholders or if it's in a trust, whoever, wherever, 100% ownership does have to be accounted for at all times. The entity type is vital as well, just so that the producer can send the correct waiver form to the group for completion, as well as so that the regulatory entities, again, can just make sure that what is on file is accurate. So there's not going to be an issue where the Secretary of State website shows a group is an LLC, but when on the Department of Industrial Relations or the Work Comp Rating Bureau, their records won't show a partnership or sole proprietor or any sort of confusion like that. Everything is going to align perfectly. And the FEIN number is vital as well, because that's essentially how the WCRB checks if a group has work comp coverage. So every time a work comp group is written and we get the FEIN number and we submit the FEIN number, the carrier sends to the regulatory entity and says, hey, here's the organization's name, here's the organization's FEIN number. We need you to generate a what's called a Bureau ID number, and we need you to update that Bureau ID number and FEIN number to show this workers' compensation policy number. And again, this is just to make sure that when the regulatory entities are doing a random audit, or if they're just investigating in general, that when they see a particular policy, they can verify that that organization does indeed have workers' compensation coverage. Or in another situation where a former insured or former member of the organization wants to double check that their employer has work comp coverage, that the employer's information has work comp information linked together, so that there's no issue where an organization is incorrectly hit with a non-compliance notice. This is almost very rare, but confirmation if the operations are changing is sometimes requested, and this is really just in case whether or not staff members need to be reclassified or re-rated, or if a new employee classification needs to be added onto the policy. This is very rare, but typically the only times this might come along is when an organization is being bought out by another business. This again is just in case the two organizations are trying to meld services together, so that when the old organization dissolves and gets absorbed into a new one, that work comp record is kept 100% accurate. So really, it's pretty easy to report an ownership change with the regulatory entities. The first step is going to the Workers' Compensation Insurance Rating Bureau's website and using their system called WCRB Connect to report the change. All producers that are going to report an ownership change need to use the WCRB's website. It's extremely easy to set up an account. You just have to reach out to WCRB and they can set you up. I believe there's a fee, an annual fee associated with it. I don't recall if it's $100 or if it's just $50. I'll try to investigate that and get that to you guys in the email. But kind of a general overview is that when you go onto WCRB Connect website, you're going to search the group first, and it's just going to be the Bureau ID number, business name, address, and or FEIN number. I strongly recommend just using the FEIN number since that almost never changes. Once you click the group's name, you're essentially going to get this page. So this is where you start. You enter, it's a little hard to see here, but FEIN number, Bureau ID number, or just a relevant policyholder information. And then you click the name, and then it'll bring to this page. And then for the purpose of an ownership change, which is really the majority of what you guys might be doing, is you're going to click Submit Ownership Information. And then it should take you to this screen. And it's just going to prompt you on some pretty basic questions like, what are you reporting? Are you reporting an entity change? Are you reporting an organization being absorbed into another organization? Is the organization changing entity types? Is the organization getting new shareholders? Something like that. Pretty much, you're just going to follow the prompts until you get through the rest of it. And then any supporting documentation or any sort of commentary you would like to provide, just to give a little more details regarding the ownership change, that can be made at the end of the page as well. So really, for our broker partners, we already have a WCRB membership. So when you guys submit a work comp group with us and it gets sold, we can directly service that group in terms either communicating with the group saying, hey, welcome aboard. Um, this is your work comp policy. This is how you file a claim. This is how your coverage works. These are all the pertinent information, including any sort of ownership changes as well. So as long as the group is communicating either with you or us, we can get that ownership change completed on the groups or on your behalf very quickly and very easily. And we always ask for information ahead of time just so that we can clarify whether or not something actually needs to be reported to WCRB or whether or not it's just a very simple policy update. We also make sure that when we get those questions about ownership, we make it very clear to the group whether or not the group is going to be rewritten, whether or not they're going to undergo a mail audit report again, anything like that. Really, the only thing we would just need is just to have the ownership change or entity change made known to us prior to the effective date of the change. That way we can report the change timely, get all the necessary exclusion forms together, and more importantly, we can just make sure that there's no issue where a new owner came on board, the ownership change was reported late, and because that ownership change was reported late, the new owner officer has to be included in coverage until we get that waiver form in. So an example would be, let's say there's an ownership or organization, that has one owner, it's a corporation. They hire a vice president 3 months later, and this new owner has 50% ownership. We were not made known of the ownership change until 7 months later. Well, unfortunately, the new VP, the new owner with 50% ownership, would be included in coverage from the third month. Well, essentially, they would be including coverage for 4 months. Because on the third month, they came on board. We weren't made known of it until the 7th month. So there's a 4-month period where the person was an owner and they didn't have their exclusion form included or submitted to the carrier. So at the end of the audit, we can expect the VP's payroll to be included in the premium audit calculations for at least 4 months. And another kind of a utility item is that when we get a work comp submission, and the group is essentially asking, do we need work comp coverage? We do audit that process as well. So let's say you have a group, they have 2 owners, and they're thinking of hiring a staff member. We can have that conversation with the group and say, okay, when do you have your first employee? Is this employee going to be working from the United States or in a foreign country, essentially? We can have that conversation and then determine whether or not the organization needs work comp immediately or whether or not they can delay work comp coverage until finally they hire that first U.S. employee. That's something we can work out with your groups directly, or if you want, we can be a part of that conversation with you included as well, or directly with you, however you guys prefer it. Okay, so we're starting to wind down, but again, these are just some of the ways to connect with BNP. We have a Twitter, YouTube, with webinars like this, a LinkedIn. We are providing text alerts, but this is something that's opt-in and more for, it's not going to be something that's going to spam you guys, but something that's quite relevant. Significant network changes, rate alerts, any time-sensitive information, vital time-sensitive information can be texted to you guys if you opt in. And of course, you guys are receiving our emails as well. So I want to thank you all for joining me. So just before I get into some of the questions, I'm just going to go over a few FAQs. I'll start with the questions regarding ownership change. Okay. So when it comes to one owner, what am I sure about another business? So that kind of is a trickier question. The question specifically is regarding ownership change. One of my insurers just bought another business. Whose responsibility is to report that change in ownership? It depends on who the majority owner is. This is going to get really into the weeds. So this might be a conversation afterwards, but to kind of give a general overview, wait, discard the question, please. I missed that. But generally speaking, the majority, this is a topic for another webinar, but generally speaking, majority ownership in terms of business purchases is going to determine which prevailing work comp policy is there, as well as who the responsible party is. Essentially, whoever has the remaining work comp policy is the one that's going to be responsible for all the reporting, all the servicing, et cetera, et cetera. But again, just for some quick FAQs, really, if you have an owner-only group and they're looking to hire a new employee, work comp becomes vital when they hire a U.S. employee. So let's say you have an owner-only group in California, and they're saying, hey, we're going to hire a new employee. Well, that's perfect. Where are you going to hire them? Oh, we're going to hire them from Korea or Bangladesh. Oh, well, they're working outside of the US, therefore the regulatory rules would be different. They're going to be bound by the regulatory rules of their home state. Really, the only time work comp is needed is when you have an employee in the United States, and this includes 1099 employees. I can't stress that enough. For the United States, so long as you have an employee, someone has to be providing them workers' compensation coverage. Either that individual isn't covering themselves, the 1099 is being covered by the contracting out agency, or they're being covered by the employer. And when it comes to the audit, the carriers, they really don't care. They just say, okay, if we see this person on your payroll, we're going to assume that that person is covered under your work comp unless you can provide proof otherwise. And proof otherwise is not just going to, usually isn't just going to be a certificate of insurance. The carrier auditor is going, in fact, to request a policy document that shows an effective date, premium, and they're going to check that effective date and term date and make sure it syncs up with your coverage as well. Just to make sure that because again, the carriers, they can get in really big trouble if they just let a staff member not be included in work comp coverage. So there's a question regarding the WCRB wanting the FEIN number from the seller, and I 100% agree that the WCRB more often than not wants the FEIN number, and unfortunately, there really isn't much of a workaround for that. The next thing might be to acquire the Beere ID number, but I really doubt if the seller is going to have that information on hand, let alone even know that. One unreliable workaround, unfortunately, and I really want to emphasize unreliable, is that you can use a third-party website that might have the group's bureau ID, that might have the seller's bureau ID number, and then you can take that information, search it with the WCRB, and then verify it that way. Again, this is not at all a reliable information, but it at least can get the ball started in terms of a submission. And then while the submission is going through and you're asking underwriting questions, you can also ask the seller, can I get the FAI number anytime soon? Unfortunately, as far as I know, there's not much of a workaround in terms of getting that FAIN number. I mean, the only other options I could think of is maybe liaising with the seller's agent or with their CPA, or maybe a medical employer application. But really, unfortunately, that's kind of one of the tough things that's usually really tough to get. And there's a question referencing Compline. I am indeed referencing Compline. The reason I kind of emphasize it's unreliable is that when you compare information from Compline and information from the WCRB's information is always going to rule. This is with the carrier, and this is with the regulatory entities as well. And this is particularly important when it comes to rating and XMODs. Compline doesn't make XMods. Compline doesn't really mark who is indeed covered. They essentially pull out the information from the Work Comp Insurance Rating Bureau. So the Work Comp Insurance Rating Bureau essentially is the Bible when it comes to any sort of ownership change, XMod, even verifying coverage as well. So if there aren't any other questions, again, please let me know. Via email or phone, again, we can have that more detailed discussion. Again, this is really a high-level overview, so any sort of questions that might go into some of the more finer details, please let me know. I'm more than happy to have a conference call with you and to summarize the information via email, or even if you need that assistance with a group directly, I'm more than willing to reach out to the group directly, or to have that conference call with you as well, just to make sure that everyone's fully clear on what's going on and how we can work this out. So again, thank you all so much for your time, and I hope you all have the wonderful rest of your day. Bye.